My son had no idea I was making $45,000 a month. His wife stood in the doorway, slapped her hand against the jamb like a verdict, and shouted, "We don't need this old woman here." It was the sort of sentence that removes you from a room before you even realize you've left. I remember the plate of lemon meringue pie cooling on the counter, a Sunday ritual I'd kept since Daniel was small. The pie sat there when the door slammed. The laughter in the dining room stopped. My name felt like an accusation. I wasn't always the kind of woman who made people stop like that. I spent 30 years in other people's balance sheets, financial consulting, long hours in glass offices where people argued about projections as if they were arguments about weather. I learned how to make numbers behave, how to fold contingency into plan. I learned discretion the hard way. After Robert died, some of that caution hardened into habit. You keep certain things to yourself because otherwise the world begins to treat you like someone else's problem to be solved. At home, I lived modestly. A townhome with a small, straight garden. I kept an old wool coat that had a moth hole only I noticed. I drank my coffee black. I did not air my salary. The $45,000 a month was a number the tax forms knew and the bank saw. It was not small talk at family meals. I helped my son more than most mothers would. The down payment on their house, $200,000, was money we could have left in an estate or invested to grow quietly. Instead, I wrote a check. There were reasons. Daniel and I had survived a decade of transition after his father's stroke and then his death. I watched my son try to balance single parenthood and the odd economics of a young family. I thought I was giving him a start, not an anchor that would weigh him down. I put the deed in my name because, at the time, it felt like insurance. Not as control, not as a threat, but as the kind of quiet precaution every prudent woman of a certain age learns to take. When something happens, you want the trace of your intent to be clear. It also allowed me to keep the payments flowing automatically, to protect a house I wanted for my grandchildren's Sunday breakfasts. I did it in a way that kept the family's dignity intact. The mortgage payments left my account, but were routed so no one needed to know the source. That was the modest, invisible charity of a woman who had watched too many crises unravel over pride and secrets. Sunday dinners had been our anchor for years. We gathered at their house most weeks, pasta at 6, wine at 7, the small absurdities of a life with children who are also adults. Jessica was the newest element in this orbit, fiery and efficient in a way Daniel admired and sometimes deferred to. Early on, I admired her. She made a career look simple, and she gave Daniel the kind of focus he had trouble applying to himself. They were a team. Or they were supposed to be. The first time I realized the tides were turning, it was in small ways. A look across the table. A plate set a degree too far from me. A complaint muttered after I'd stood up to clear dishes. "We're drowning." I let those comments slide at first. People exaggerate. Young parents misstate their finances when they're tired. But I noticed how Jessica talked when Daniel wasn't present, how she reshaped stories, how she would finish his sentences or correct a memory. They were skirting toward a narrative where my presence was a liability, and whose story would go unchallenged if I remained silent. The night it broke open, the house smelled of garlic and basil. Patricia, my oldest friend, was there by invitation. She loved Daniel and the kids the way some people love thunderstorms, loudly and without restraint. We were midway through pie when the discussion dipped into bills. Someone mentioned a tax audit at work. Then Jessica, looking suddenly tight and very young in the way exhaustion makes you look, said, "We're drowning. We can't keep this up." Her voice didn't have room enough for nuance. It had been rehearsed. Daniel's shoulders nodded. He is not a man of confrontation. He is the kind of person who will sign the forms and shoulder the bills because he interprets love as action. He did not speak. Then Jessica stepped to the doorway. She was closer to me than I remembered she could be. She placed both hands on her hips and addressed him with a certainty that was almost theatrical. "Throw her out." she said. "We don't need this old woman here." The words arrived like a punch because they weren't just about space or a couch. They were about identity. They were a public stripping of the dignity I inhabited every morning when I dressed for work, every afternoon when I balanced ledgers and counseled clients who believed in composed, rational solutions. She turned my presence into a problem. I left the kitchen with the kind of composure that has been forged by years of professional meetings where tone and temperature must be calibrated precisely. I remember thinking, this is not the moment to make a scene. I put on my coat slowly, because indignation is most eloquent when it is measured. I said softly, "I'll take that pie home," and I took the box. In the car, I did not cry. I sat in the driver's seat and watched the rain on the windshield make little trembling maps. I started calculating. Old training. When emotion threatens to reshape the terrain, you name the facts. I reviewed what I knew, pushed aside the sting. The memory of Robert's hand on mine in a hospital corridor. The years when insurance and uncertainty were a constant background hum. The times we ate takeout and called it indulgence. All of it made an odd companion to the present. The next morning, I made a list. Not of what I would do to Jessica or Daniel. This is important. I made a list of what I would do to protect myself. Protection is not the same as punishment. I was not looking for revenge. I wanted clarity. I wanted respect. I wanted the truth to be undeniable. First, I reviewed the deed. I had always suspected that the paperwork would give me leverage if ever it was required. I had not expected leverage to feel bitter. The deed was in my name. My name was there like a ledger entry. Margaret Ellis, owner. I had the paperwork, the original transfer, the second mortgage that had been paid down. The down payment, $200,000, had been my gift. I had records. There was a trail of auto-pay transactions that left my accounts and went to their mortgage servicer like clockwork. Some of those transfers had been set up so neatly that no one raised a question. They were anonymized in an old way, many years ago, measured, quiet, intended to avoid embarrassment. I called Tom Chen. I did not say lawyer in the way some people say doctor, as if to summon a miracle. I said Tom because he has been my counsel for ordinary things and extraordinary misfortunes. "I was told to leave my son's house last night," I said. "What can I do about it?" He listened without hurry. "Tell me everything," Tom said. I told him a lot. I held nothing back, because discretion in the present requires candor about the past. "I'm not asking you to do anything illegal," I told him. "I want the situation resolved so that no one can say later that I had no choice." Tom said he would look at the deed and advise on options. He said nothing that sounded like instruction to viewers. He simply said that in the story of my life, this needed to be made visible in ways that silence could no longer accommodate. I also called Patricia. She lives 2 towns over, where the streets are named for dead poets, and she has always been the friend who says what needs to be said in a tone so blunt that you mistake her honesty for cruelty until you realize it's love. "You mustn't lose your head, Margaret," she said, "but you mustn't give away your truth either." She recommended I sleep on it. She suggested I document everything. The way she said it, document everything, felt like the kind of practical sentence a woman with my training enjoys. She did not mean I should turn my family into a courtroom exhibit. She meant that facts matter. Facts are a kind of mercy. They can shrink the space where rumor thrives. They can also show you in cold detail whether you are being prudent or conniving. I wanted to be the former. Over the following week, I watched them closely. Not with cameras or invasive tactics, something else entirely, and not what I would ever condone, but with attention. The autopay arrived in their ledger as it always had. I checked my statements and saw the familiar flows. There was a satisfaction in seeing the numbers align. I saw, too, small gestures in Daniel that had nothing to do with money. He started calling more late at night, voice low, tired. He would say things like, "I'll take care of it," and then add, I'm sorry. There was a private exhaustion in him I did not recognize at first. It humanized him in a way that complicated my anger. Jessica, for her part, took to treating me like a problem to be managed. She was efficient in the way people are when fear of scarcity sharpens the will. She began making lists aloud about budgeting and cuts and sacrifices, as if listing them would make them real. One evening, as I was leaving, she said to Daniel with that same hard certainty that had moved her to the doorway months before, "We didn't ask for her money. We didn't want this." The phrase "we didn't ask" sounded reasonable. Under it was the implication that my presence had been an unrequested liability. There's an old cadence to ingratitude. It often dresses itself in self-righteousness. It was not my job to correct the twist of their narrative with indignation. It was my job to respond with clarity. I began gathering material, not to punish, but to make visible what had always been true. I am not naive. I knew that money reshapes relationships. Money gives and takes, it confers and it erases. But there is a difference between generosity and erasure. When you give, you expect at least the dignity of acknowledgement. When you are erased, you become invisible, except for the ledger lines that only accountants and lawyers can read. I asked Tom to pull the recorded instruments on the house. He did so and sent me copies, certified copies with county stamps. Seeing my name next to the house's legal description made something settle in my chest. Ownership is a technical thing, prosaic and literal, and also a moral one. Whose name holds the burden and the gift? Mine had for a long time. I also went to my bank and pulled the histories I had a right to see, my own history. I looked at the pattern of automated transfers. Some had memo lines that were empty. Some were routed through an account created years earlier for ease of life. There it was, a pattern that told a story I had written and never advertised. There were other kinds of evidence, too. I had the photos of the children at the house Christmas morning. I had emails where Daniel had asked for advice about repairs. I had voicemail messages he'd left when he could not reach me at the office. I had all of these small things, and each of them was its own tiny proof of the life I had funded. That evening, I sat with the paperwork on my kitchen table. The lemon meringue pie was gone. Patricia had eaten the last slice when she came to check on me. I made a small pot of tea and called Rachel Kim, a mediator who used to run a community conflict clinic. She knows families. She knows how truth can be shut down not by malice alone, but by fear. "You don't have to make a public spectacle," she said. "You can ask for space and respect, Margaret. Your name doesn't have to become a weapon." Rachel's voice had an evenness that felt like a rope thrown to a boat in rough water. I wanted a rope that would bring us back to a table where honesty had a place. But I also wanted to make it impossible for Jessica to erase the facts of the matter with a single shout. Facts are bad at theatrics. They were my ally. So I made 3 decisions that week: keep my composure, collect my records, and prepare for a mediation where the truth would have to face the light. I did not want to humiliate anyone, least of all my son. I wanted accountability. Accountability is not the same as vengeance. It means owning the consequences of one's words and actions. If Jessica wanted to demand I leave, then she had to do it on the basis of reality, not on dramatic pronouncements in front of the children. When I told Daniel, quietly and alone in his living room, that I was organizing my papers and speaking to a mediator, he looked at me like someone who'd been found in possession of a secret he'd hidden to protect someone else. He was fatigued in a way I had not fully appreciated. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said. It was not the contrite line of someone who had thought through consequences. It was an admission of failure, of having let things pile up until the air was too thin to breathe. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, not angrily, but because I needed the truth. He swallowed and looked at his hands. "I thought I was paying it back," he said. "I thought it was the right thing." The sentence hung between us like a bridge that had been under maintenance for a very long time. That confession, incomplete as it was, complicated everything. It made clear that this was not only a story about entitlement or cruelty. It suggested exhaustion, pride, and a private set of decisions that had shaped the public drama. It humanized him. It did not excuse Jessica's words at the doorway, but it explained why his voice had been quiet when hers rose. I did not confront him in the living room. That moment was not for judgment. I told him I would set a time to talk more carefully, with documents on the table and a third person present. He nodded like a man trying to find the shape of the apology he could offer without crumpling. After that call, I sat at my kitchen table and pulled the deed file out again. I let the chain of events slow into a ledger of choices. The deed in my name, the $200,000 down payment, the month after month of transfers, the hush that had wrapped around the house so perfectly someone could shout, "Throw her out," without thinking they had said anything of consequence. My lawyer suggested a straightforward course of action in neutral terms. Put the facts where the public record could see them if it came to that, and proceed toward mediation if possible. He used phrases I recognized from courts and conference rooms: recorded instrument, constructive notice, mediation schedule. Each phrase was a small, legalized rope thrown across a distance that might or might not be bridged. And then the part I had not expected. When I told friends and a few trusted colleagues that I was moving toward mediation, because a woman does not make a demand like that lightly, almost everyone I told responded with something like, "I wish you'd told me sooner." There was a softness to those responses, an ache that came from not having been let into the story. I thought about secrets and why we keep them. The $45,000 a month enabled me to live now in ways that were generous and deliberate. It also meant the ledger of my life had been brighter than my social face. I had wanted to protect my son's pride. It had cost me being able to call on close friends' counsel when I might have needed it. I hired an investigator, not to film anyone, to set a trap, or to create late-night scandals. I hired him to corroborate what my records already suggested, to bring one more sensible, sober voice into a world suddenly thick with accusation. He was a man of practical manners who delivered reports in neat paragraphs. He called me after the first week with a voice that had the kind of quiet our city reserves for important sentences. "There's nothing illegal here," he said, "just a pattern. Payments from an account in your name, transfers labeled to the mortgage servicer, emails with repair requests from Daniel. Nothing surprising, but a clear trail." A clear trail. I liked the phrase because it sounded like a cartographer describing a river. I spread the papers across my kitchen table, and for the first time since the doorway incident, felt like I had a map. The map did two things. It affirmed what I already knew. My money had gone to keep a home, and it gave me a way forward that was less about drama and more about negotiation. I wanted a resolution where Daniel did not have to lose his home, but where respect was restored. I wanted Jessica to see that words have consequences. I wanted the children to grow up with a family that had learned to name things honestly. What I did not want was to become a story they told at parties, the mother who tried to buy her way back into affection. That would be humiliating in a way money cannot fix. So I wrote down the terms I was willing to accept in principle, measured things, like structured repayment if Daniel had been secretly paying me back, or a formal transfer if everyone agreed it was best. I kept the numbers rational in their plainness. I considered trusts for the grandchildren so that my generosity would be bounded by purpose, not by impulse. When I told Patricia, she cried once into the phone. "You always gave with such nobility," she said. "You never asked for thanks." She was right. I had given without drawing attention, because sometimes the humility of generosity is the last place dignity can hide. Humility is noble until it is used as a doorstop. Then it becomes a thing that keeps individuals from asking for the respect they deserve. 2 days after the investigator's call, Jessica and Daniel texted to say they were willing to sit for a mediated conversation. I felt something tighten and loosen at the same time. The prospect of the table made my chest ache. I wanted to be heard, but not at the cost of making my son feel humiliated. I wanted accountability that repaired rather than crushed. I set the date. I did not go because I wanted to triumph. I went because I wanted the household to be able to breathe again under the same roof. I wanted to make visible the difference between giving and being invisible. I wanted to teach an example to the grandchildren about boundaries, that kindness is not license for disrespect. On the morning of the mediation, I walked slowly down my hallway and noticed the small things a life leaves behind. A framed watercolor of a street we once walked in Paris, Robert's old wristwatch in a drawer I never opened. The day was clear, not an obvious sign of anything, just daylight that made the kitchen counters shine. I put on a coat I liked and left quietly, because leaving quietly is its own kind of statement. At the mediator's office, chairs in a small circle, the air smelled of coffee and paper. Rachel sat across from us with the evenness I trusted. Daniel looked exhausted in the way people are when they've been trying to hold together two different truths. Jessica had that tightness in her jaw that suggested conviction at the cost of compassion. The first minutes were a tangle of emotions softened into procedure. Rachel asked people to speak their truths. Jessica said what she'd said before. They were drowning, that she felt like a stepmother to the children's finances, that pride prevented her from accepting help. She framed it not as a wholesale rejection of me, but as a survival plan. The words were logical. They were also sharp. When it was my turn, I kept my voice steady. I spoke of reasons, why the deed had been in my name, why I had wanted to avoid public drama, why I had thought anonymity could allow dignity. I did not raise my voice. I did not list $45,000 like a threat. I told them what the numbers had done, kept a roof over their heads, paid for repairs, provided for small things that add up to daily life. I spoke of the down payment of $200,000 like a fact from my past that needed acknowledgement in their present. After the session, there was a thinness to the apologies offered, contrived phrases that suggested performance rather than penitence. Jessica, in particular, proposed a buyout number that sounded practical on the surface but felt like predation. It assumed I would prefer cash over dignity and suggested a settlement that favored leverage over repair. I listened, made notes, and felt something in me stick to old rules, that accountability cannot be replaced by a check with strings. I left mediation with more questions than answers. The language of settlement can sound tidy until you realize tidy covers a great many things. I had to decide then whether I would accept a convenience that smoothed everything over at the cost of erasure. Would I take money to be told later that I was a problem no one wanted around? I could not imagine a restoration built on the cost of my own invisibility. That evening, Daniel called quietly from his car. He was the kind of man who apologizes by doing small things, rather than declaiming in big ones. "I don't want her to be wrong," he said. "I don't want you to believe I didn't try." "You don't have to prove yourself to me," I told him. "But you were silent when she spoke for you. That silence has consequences." There is a line of sorrow in that exchange I could not overlook. It is easier to be furious than to watch someone you love confess to cowardice. But courage is not the immediate knowledge of what to do. It is the willingness to accept the hard work of repairing what you've let erode. The week after mediation, I went back to my documents. I printed a copy of the recorded deed and kept it in my folder. I wrote down, carefully and without rancor, the options I would accept. A negotiated transfer under clear and public terms, structured trusts for grandchildren, a modest gift for them, and then the rest allocated to causes that mattered to me. I thought about charity, about the impulse to give beyond family, when family did not meet the terms of common decency. I thought about the $200,000 like an old ledger entry that deserved a settlement consonant with faithfulness, not capitulation. On a Tuesday in late afternoon, just as the light in my kitchen turned the counters a soft gold, Tom called with a matter-of-fact voice. "Margaret." he said. "It may be useful to put clear evidence into the public record, so there's no confusion later. A recorded instrument makes the factual state of ownership accessible to anyone who looks." He said it as an answer in a long set of procedural choices. I could hear he was careful with his words. He knows the difference between making a point in court and making a spectacle. I told him to proceed as he believed prudent for my situation. That is a sentence that carries weight. It trusts someone else to perform a function that I otherwise would have done myself. But there is dignity in trusting competence. There is also a difference between planting flags out of spite and ensuring that the map is legible. That evening I sat with the deed again and felt something settle. There was a small tremor of satisfaction, not a triumphal grin, but a cleaning, like opening a window after a long winter. My name was there. The transfers were there. The $200,000 down payment was a trace. The past was visible. I had not planned to make any grand statements in public. I had no desire to humiliate anyone. But I had decided that silence was no longer an option. When someone stands in your doorway and says you are not needed, the correct answer is not always a louder voice. Sometimes the correct answer is patience, facts, and the refusal to be erased. That night, as rain stitched gray lines on my windows, an investigator's email arrived with the simple subject line, "Report attached." I opened it with the same careful ritual I used when opening an old photograph. The first page summarized transactions. The second appended copies of the mortgage statements showing the lender and the payroll routes. There was a note at the bottom written in the investigator's practical hand. "There is evidence of consistent payment flow from an account in your name to the mortgage servicer. No foul play detected, just a clear pattern." I set the report next to the deed, closed the cover of my binder, and thought about the next conversation we would have at a table with chairs and coffee, and the small politenesses people use when they mean to be kind but are unsure how. I felt both the sting of the doorway and the cool steadiness of someone who had decided not to be moved by theatrics alone. Preparation felt less like scheming and more like tendering the truth. I had a file. I had allies. I had a plan that began with asking for what dignity looks like in a family that had lost its way. There would be other choices ahead, harder ones, but for the moment the map was made and the river was visible. In the early hours, I called Patricia and woke her, knowing she would pick up and that she would understand even my small anxieties. "You did the right thing," she said before I finished telling her about the investigator's note. "You did not react. You acted with the slow discretion you were always taught. Now let them show who they are." When the sun rose, I put on my coat and walked to the mailbox. It felt, absurdly, like the end of a small pilgrimage. The house at the end of their street would continue to be a place of children's cries and dishwater and laundry. It would be a home whether or not anyone recognized the cost of keeping it. My presence there, by design or oversight, had become a test of what the family valued. I could not decide their values for them, but I could decide how I would be treated within them. A few days later, a terse text from Jessica arrived. "We need to talk." It was not a request. It was a line drawn in the hot sand of a shoreline. I told Tom about the text. He advised, calmly, that a mediated conversation might be the way to translate that demand into something that looked like reconciliation instead of performance. I sat with the binder on my lap, my fingers at the edge of the paper, and felt something settle into place the way a bone finds its comfortable socket. I was not naive about the work ahead. I knew lawyerly language can be a blunt instrument. I knew that some people speak apologies like a costume, but I also knew I was tired of being rendered small by the private economies of other people's pride. There will be a point in this story where truths must be spoken aloud, in a room where consequences are not merely rhetorical. There will also be a point where a son's exhaustion is revealed not as excuse, but as explanation. For now, I folded the report into my binder, put the deed in the place I keep the things I must not lose, and breathed. This was not the end of the matter. It was, finally, the beginning of a different way of being seen. If this is hitting you in the chest, tap like and tell me which city you're watching from. I like knowing where these voices land. After I filed the certified copies, and Tom moved to have the recorded instrument placed in the county records, there was a small, exacting ceremony that felt at once administrative and vindicating. The clerk at the county office stamped the papers with an official thud. The recording number was assigned. My name, Margaret Ellis, sat beside the legal description like an unarguable sentence. It was not a shout. It was a pin dropped on a map. When Jessica saw the county recording, she found out the way a person finds out a curtain has been pulled. Suddenly, on display. She texted in the way people text when their fingers move faster than their breaths. "Who recorded that?" she wrote. "Why would she do that?" The tone was more accusation than question. Daniel called almost immediately after, voice thin and rasped, like a candle flame in wind. "Mom, what are you doing?" he asked. "I made the facts plain," I said. I did not begin with how I felt. I began by naming the truth as if it were a piece of furniture we all had to step around. I asked Tom to make the status of the property visible. I'm not trying to shame anyone. I'm trying to keep the record honest. Honest is an awkward word in a family language. It sounds like a law book until grief or pride translate it into knives. But I had chosen my language carefully because I did not want to fuel theater. I wanted a table. Jessica replied with a string of messages that moved between fury and bargaining. There was a paragraph about privacy and a sentence about, "We didn't need this woman making business of our lives." She accused me of cynicism, of turning a mother's place into leverage. She accused me, quietly but with heat, of using money like a weapon. "What you don't understand," I said later to Tom on the line, "is that I never imagined I would need anything. I just wanted to be able to show a fact when facts were denied." He said nothing judgmental. He only asked what outcome I wanted. I told him I wanted dignity restored, and I wanted a plan where the children and grandchildren could remain housed and whole if possible. We set another mediation. Rachel agreed to sit again. This time I insisted on a neutral room, and we scheduled when the children would not be present. I wanted a space large enough for the truth, and small enough that it could not be performed for an audience. I wanted a quiet place for an ugly conversation to learn how to become, finally, a repair. On the morning of the mediation, the rain had stopped, and the city looked scrubbed. I found Daniel in the small coffee shop beneath his office, hands wrapped around a paper cup like someone trying to warm a regret. His hair was thinner, and the lines at his eyes had deepened in a way that made me think of the years he had tried to shoulder everything. "I'm sorry," he said before we had even settled. It was the kind of apology that reached through sleep-deprived nights and clumsy compromises. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I set up payments, Mom. I was trying to pay you back without making you feel indebted." He explained haltingly how he'd taken extra shifts, how he had sold tools and restricted his own small pleasures. He'd been depositing a little each month into an account I had helped him open after Robert died, something we arranged when money felt like a fragile raft, and then routing transfers to the mortgage servicer on his end. He thought it was fair to be the one to give what he could. He did not want me to sacrifice myself for his sense of dignity. "You never told me," I said, and it was not accusation. It was the ache of discovery in a language I had taught him. Data and facts matter. "You were silent because you thought you were protecting me." Daniel's face crumpled with honesty. "I was ashamed," he said, "and embarrassed. I didn't want you to think I couldn't manage anything on my own. I'm so tired, Mom. I tried to make it right in a way I thought would keep you proud." That confession undid some of the ice between us. It did not erase the doorway scene. It did not make Jessica's words into something less. It did something stranger. It reconfigured the problem. This was not only about cruelty, it was about how pride and shame can be confused for integrity. At the mediation, the air had that tension that comes when people have rehearsed apologies in their heads and then hear their own words out loud. Rachel asked us, gently, to speak to needs rather than to hurt. Jessica read from a script she had clearly prepared. We never asked for money. We didn't want to feel beholden. My point is that the arrangement felt wrong for our family. She used the word felt like armor. Then she offered a number. Cold, calculated, and oddly disrespectful. It was, essentially, a buyout, a lump sum in exchange for my quiet, a price put on erasure. The figure was reasonable at a glance, if your ledger only observed market rates without seeing the ledger of generosity and quiet service that lay behind them. It assumed I would prefer a check to the restoration of dignity. It assumed leverage was currency they could spend. I told them simply, I will not be bought into silence. I explained what I would accept, structured fairness that recognized the gift of the down payment and the months of automatic support while preserving a way for Daniel and his family to remain in the home if that was the best path forward for the children. I suggested, not as an instruction to anyone else, but as a personal preference, that trusts for the grandchildren might preserve the intention of my gift without allowing it to be erased in conversation or memory. The mediator, Rachel, pushed us toward particulars. She did not negotiate values for me. She asked questions. How much of the house's burden had been carried by me? Could we draw a path that allowed the home to be a home and not a battleground? Could the parties agree to therapy and counseling for money conversations? Those last points, therapy, education, measurable steps, felt like small, practical cords to tie a family back together. What surprised me in that room was not Jessica's sharpness, but Daniel's wavering. He wanted to give them something to smooth things over, but he also wanted to be honest with me, and could not find the language that made both possible. We talked of deferred maintenance, of the mortgage balance, of what the neighborhood could bear in price. I kept thinking of the children running through the kitchen where, once, lemon meringue pies sat cooling. When the session reached the point where words alone would not do, I did what I had planned. I insisted on clarity. A transfer would be public if it were to happen, and any settlement would be documented with clear terms about the grandchildren's protections. Irrevocable trusts, with allocations earmarked for education and housing. The creation of a small fund for emergency medical support, and a charity allocation that reflected the life Robert and I had thought important. That is when Jessica's posture softened, and it was not theatrical. She was, finally, honestly frightened. If we have to ask for therapy and classes, what if it's too much? What if this becomes about our failures? She looked at Daniel and then at me. For a long beat, the room breathed as if waiting. I'm not asking you to be perfect, I said. I'm asking you to be willing. There is a difference between absolution and the willingness to change. The first is instantaneous. The second is a slow, daily practice. We ended that session with a framework rather than a closure, an agreement to explore sale options, to have an independent appraisal, and to draft terms that protected the grandchildren's interests. There was a conditional apology from Jessica, phrased so tightly it might have been sewn onto a costume, but the timeline was set. The next stage would be concrete. I returned home that evening grateful for the absence of theater, and aware, acutely, that lawyers and mediators can do only so much. The rest is people doing the ordinary work of restraint and repair. We listed the house within a month. I did not want to present the family with a sudden vacancy. Children need the steadiness of routine. We sought to sell in a market that had been kind to houses like theirs. Within a matter of weeks, we had offers. The highest came in at $695,000. That number sat on the page like a resolution with too many meanings, an end to one chapter, and the beginning of several new accounts. The sale itself was quiet and strangely intimate. The buyers were a young couple who wanted space for a small child and a workshop for making things on Sundays. They wrote a letter about the light in the kitchen and how they loved lemon meringue pies. I took the letter home and folded it into my binder like a good omen. From the proceeds of the sale, after mortgage payoff and fees, I made the decisions I had written on the kitchen table. I created 3 irrevocable trusts, one for each grandchild, structured for education and early home purchase assistance. Each trust was seeded with a sum intended to be meaningful, but not excessive. The point was not to erase responsibility, but to prevent poverty from dictating a child's horizon. A portion of the proceeds was donated to charities that had been a quiet part of Robert's and my life, an elder care program that supports respite for caregivers, and a literacy fund for underfunded schools where children like mine had once sat. I bought a small condo, a south-facing place with a balcony that overlooked a thin line of trees. It was not a mansion. It was a home I liked, deliberately chosen so I would not become the myth of a woman who hoarded wealth, but instead someone who used resource to create safety and possibility. The condo would be mine to live in and enjoy. I also set aside a portion, enough to help Daniel in a practical way if he needed it, to address the financial tightness he faced without undoing the lessons he had to learn. More importantly than dollars were the conditions I tied to future gifts, conditions that sounded severe until you remembered why boundaries exist. The trusts for the grandchildren had stipulations meant to encourage education, to support responsible home choices, and to require financial education before disbursement. The gifts were not punishments. They were structural nudges that said, "We love you, and we will not let love be the only teacher of responsibility." As for Daniel and Jessica, we drafted a plan that required them to participate in a financial counseling program and in couples counseling with a therapist who specialized in money dynamics. No one was forced into anything more shameful than asking for help. The terms were not about humiliation. They were about establishing practices to prevent future harm. They agreed, reluctantly at first, and then with a recognition that these were terms that asked them to do the hard work of being better than their momentary impulses. The public apologies came later, small and private. Jessica, weeks after the sale, met me at a small coffee shop and said, plainly, "I'm sorry for what I said at the doorway. I was afraid and angry, and I said something cruel." She did not ask for forgiveness the way one asks for a receipt. She offered an apology and left it unencumbered. Daniel, too, apologized without theater. It was not grand. It was, instead, the slow work of rebuilding trust. What changed the arc of our family was not the documents we signed so much as the slow, daily choices that followed. Sunday dinners resumed, but different. There were boundaries now, a start time and an end time, a rule that financial talk would be handled privately and with a mediator present if necessary, and a new practice of acknowledging gifts with simple gratitude in front of the children. The grandchildren watched their parents stumble toward responsibility. Sometimes people need to see the work in order to believe it. There was a moment, sitting at the closing table for the condo, when I felt an old quiet fold into something like relief. I signed papers that would give me a home and seed the possibility of a life that was less fixated on survival. I phoned Patricia and told her, and she laughed in a way that felt like sun through a window. "You did the right thing, Margaret," she said. "You made a ledger that has kindness in it." After the closure of that chapter, I cut back my hours. For 40 years, I had been a slate for other people's anxieties, a person who could read a cash flow statement the way others read a poem. I took fewer clients. I made time to travel the way Robert and I had once planned to, before sickness made such plans flimsy. I took a trip to a place where the sea sounded like good advice, a week on Cape Cod, a weekend in a town where the bakery made pies that smelled like the ones I'd left on the counter years ago. I also found companionship, again only gently, and like a plant regrowing in a window where there had been darkness. His name was Elliot, a retired teacher who came to a book group I attended. He was steady and had the sort of small humor that makes hard days seem less permanent. We did not rush or promise too much. We walked slowly, and watched the city move as if it were a thing that could be studied and learned. There were gifts in the work that followed. The grandchildren learned to set a table that mattered. Daniel and Jessica learned the hard arithmetic of pride and humility. They began, over time, to say things like, "Thank you for helping us when we needed it," in ways that were not perfunctory. Those sentences mattered more than the checks ever could. I gave to charity because it felt like completing a circle. Generosity had been a language Robert and I had used in our household, and I wanted to translate that into something public, something that could not be silenced by a shout at a doorway. I set up a small endowment for caregiver respite, named in Robert's memory, so that other families would have a place to go when the load became too heavy. The money did not fix everything, obviously. It bought services that allowed caregivers to breathe. It gave children books they might not otherwise see. It was not a cure, but it was a useful thing. People ask me sometimes, neighbors, acquaintances, the occasional caller, whether I felt triumphant when the deed was recorded and the house sold. The answer is never simple. There was satisfaction, yes, the kind that comes when truth is acknowledged. But triumph feels like another costume. I do not wear it. What I wear instead is clarity. I had acted not to humiliate, but to insist on dignity, to say that generosity does not justify being erased. There were days when I missed the old way of being invisible in my generosity. The pleasure of giving quietly has its own peace. But generosity that leads to invisibility is, I learned, a sadder thing than generosity with boundaries. When you give in a way that protects the dignity of those you love, you are not simply paying bills. You are shaping futures. When you give in a way that allows people to assume you are only a bank and not a person, then you are enabling a kind of erasure that even gratitude cannot undo. In time, the family found a new rhythm. Daniel took a job that allowed him more sleep and set aside time for therapy. Jessica enrolled in a financial workshop and discovered, to her surprise, that efficiency and compassion are not always at odds. She became, slowly, someone who could speak of budgets without letting fear do the talking. The grandchildren learned in little ways to ask for help and to offer help. They learned that secrets make small beds and that truth makes larger rooms. I could have kept working until exhaustion made my bones ache more than they already did. Instead, I chose to live in the way I had always thought of as reasonable, with purpose and with a generosity that was neither self-erasing nor theatrical. I taught the grandchildren how to make lemon meringue pie the right way. We ate it at my condo balcony with small forks and louder laughter. Once, months after the sale, Jessica stopped by unexpectedly with a bag of groceries and a hatched apology in her hands. She said, "I brought you this, and I wanted to say, thank you for making the house a place for the children while we got on our feet. I know I sounded like a coward once. I was afraid." "I know," I replied. "Fear does a lot of talking." It was not an absolution so much as an acknowledgement that people change when they are given space to. I do not dwell on the doorway anymore the way I once did. It remains a hinge in the story, an audible marker that taught us how to speak to one another differently. It taught me to insist on facts and to avoid spectacle. It taught them, eventually, to hold their pride with a hand as steady as their love. If there is a lesson here, it is not simple. It is not a map to follow. It is less about winning a house and more about the conditions you set for your generosity, how you give, to whom, and what you will not allow that gift to do to your personhood. Boundaries are a kind of kindness to oneself. Accountability is a kind of love when it is applied to those you wish to trust again. Grace is the final step, given when sincere work is shown, not before. The house sold for $695,000. I created trusts, donated to charity, bought a condo with a balcony, and carved out the rest as a cushion for future needs. Daniel and Jessica agreed to therapy and financial counseling. We stopped letting money be a ghost in the room. Instead, it became a tool we named and used intentionally, with the children watching us practice the hard art of being better. Sometimes, in the evenings when the city hums below my window, I think of Robert and of the way his hand used to close over mine. I think about the quiet things that make a life: a pie cooling on a counter, a neighbor who brings you a loaf of bread, a friend who says what you need to hear. I think about the balance sheet of a life that measures worth not only in dollars, but in dignity maintained. If you are sitting with a family question that feels like a storm, I cannot promise you a tidy ending, but I can tell you what happened to me. I chose clarity over silence, and that choice let me keep my life intact without having to wear my giving like a cloak of shame. I asked for accountability before giving grace. I demanded respect as a condition of presence, and I gave forgiveness when the work was underway. Would you have done the same? Share your thoughts or a similar story in the comments and subscribe for more real-life family stories.